Okay, so hello everyone and welcome back. And today we'll be talking about the Missouri Pacific's Texas Eagle. And the Missouri Pacific's was one of the, railroads of the Southwest Midwest, and it fielded a fleet of first-class passenger trains that were comparable to the Southern Pacific's daylights. This railroad started out, like many others, to become a transcontinental railroad, but ended up somewhere else. And the Missouri Pacific turned more into a north-south railroad, similar in ways to the Frisco and Katy, but it also ran towards the southwest instead of towards the southeast. And as mentioned in the Colorado Eagle video, the Missouri Pacific was chartered to run between St. Louis and San Francisco, but due to financial issues and the Civil War, this railroad was split into two, and one half became the Frisco and the other half became the Missouri Pacific. And the Missouri Pacific eventually fell into the orbit of J. Gould. And before we get too far into that, here's just a brief outline of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about the early history, the Sunshine Special, the Eagles in general, the Texas Eagle, and the Amtrak's version. As a quick rundown, these are not just about the Texas Eagle, or the Missouri Pacific version or the Amtrak version. We're talking the whole history of the route. So from at least a very brief overview of its early days, because there was a lot of paper railroads that got shuffled around to make the Missouri Pacific work. So not going through all of those because this is not a channel about legal issues. Anyways, this is a publicity shot on screen from the Colorado Eagle. So this is what the Eagles looked like. This was their paint scheme. It was a dark blue, cream, and silver. And anyways, we'll move on. And this is the route map of the Colorado Eagle / Sunshine Special. The main branch went from St. Louis up here all the way down and into Texas, where it started splitting at Longview and Palestine. So at Longview, it split and went to Dallas-Fort Worth, and eventually one part of it went on to El Paso to connect with the Southern Pacific. And then another section went down to Palestine and then split to either Houston, Galveston, or to Laredo. And those were the main splits of and then there's the Memphis to Little Rock chunk that eventually shuffled in here. And we'll get more into the equipment on the Eagle version of this train a little bit later, and the Sunshine Special, since it basically ran the same route. So since we're talking a little bit about Jay Gould, because he's the man who helped build the railroads in Texas. During his time running, the Missouri Pacific in Texas and his attempts at building a full transcontinental railroad, or at least family of railroads, he took over, a couple and created the International and Great Northern. And this railroad connected a good chunk of the Texas Triangle, and it ran from Dallas to Houston, Galveston, and I think over into Laredo, or it might have been another railroad that got consolidated into that. This era in Texas is kind of a mess because you basically have the Missouri Pacific as the overarching umbrella, and you have the International and Great Northern and the Missouri Pacific lines proper, and then the Texas and Pacific, and I think there was a fourth railroad in there somehow. So it gets to be a bit of a mess, and I kind of lost the plot in here, so I'm not going fully into detail on this. And as I said, the Missouri Pacific is the overarching umbrella in this part of the country that fell under Jay Gould, and then a bunch of other a bunch of other railroads also fell under this. And also during his time running the railroads in Texas, he took over, everything. This was basically the Southern Pacific of Texas, more or less. I know the SP ran in Texas, but this was the Southern Pacific's equivalent in this part of the country. And also, at this point, he owned the predecessor to the Katy Railroad, and it was eventually forced to divest it for competitive reasons. And this would he would effectively dominate Texas until the SP and Santa Fe showed up, or at least got involved later, because the SP bought out the Santa Fe and Gulf Coast Railroad, which was only other independent railroad in Texas at this point that was of note. And if you want to hear me talk more about the beginning of the Missouri Pacific, you should see the Colorado Eagle video where I talk a bit more about this. And so I'm not going to go through rehashing everything. I've already kind of did that. So we're going to start moving on to the other trains on the route. So the first premier passenger train that ran between St. Louis and Texas was the Sunshine Special, which is shown here in a promo shot, and just another little side thing about the trains. It was inaugurated by the International Great Northern before it was fully integrated into the Missouri Pacific in 1915. This was a heavyweight train that ran through Longview, Texas, where the train broke up into multiple sections, with one to Dallas, one to Fort Worth, one to El Paso, and at Palestine, one of the other section that went south ish, split to Houston and um, Laredo eventually. And there was also an auxiliary section between Memphis and Little Rock. This train basically was like a spider web. And there's also even, we'll get into this later, but there was also connections further east and further west. I will also make the note that this was the first class train to run the route, which, from what in my research, that was the note that was made. So I'm going to take that to mean that there were some other unremarkable, mostly mail trains running the route before the launch of the Sunshine Special and after the line was more or less completed, sometime in the 1800s. And the Sunshine Special would continue on even after the launch of the Eagle. The Eagle more or less supplanted the Sunshine Special once it was launched in 1948. Let me just move on to the next picture of the Texas Eagle. This is, I believe, the Texas Eagle, or it might just be another train with Eagle cars, or it could just be delivering the trains. I'm not really sure, but this was basically a picture of it, I believe, in St. Louis. I'm not sure. I forgot to write that down from I believe the Texas State Historical Society or Railroad Historical Society is where I got this picture from. Anyways, the Eagles themselves were, as mentioned, the flagship trains of the Missouri Pacific Railroad, and they were the equivalent of the Daylights. The name of the Eagle was chosen by a poll of employees of the Missouri Pacific, and they chose the name Eagle because the eagle is swift, graceful, powerful, and since the creation of our republic, the symbol of American progress, to quote the company magazine. The first Eagle ran in 1939 and grew to a fleet that connected the southern Midwest and South and Southwest. And other Eagles would include the Aztec Eagle, which ran St. Louis to Mexico City, the Valley Eagle between Houston and Brownsville, the Texas Eagle that we're talking about now, and the Missouri River Eagle that went to St. Louis, Kansas City, and then up to Omaha. Another thing I will note is that the Missouri Eagle did have a substantial schedule of mostly streamliners well into the 60s, and even in the few years before the mail contracts were gotten rid of, they still on some route had like 4 round trips a day on some routes, which is actually kind of remarkable, considering I think by the mid 60s the SP was down to like 1 or 2, like down to 2 a day max on most routes. That it still had. So the Missouri Pacific, I think, until like whatever president that came in during like I think 62-ish, more or less, really, they still really believed in their passenger trains. And there were a few railroads, like I've mentioned, that still cared about their passenger trains, or at least still believed in them. Besides the Santa Fe and Union Pacific. Like not, for whatever reason, there's always a misconception that every railway in the country was the Chicago and Northwestern or the Southern Pacific. A lot of railways were somewhere in between that and the Santa Fe. Like they weren't all like hostile. Let's just turn them all into commuter trains and cancel them like the Chicago and Northwestern, or let's just have them be rolling dumpsters like the Southern Pacific. So there was more of a spectrum of thought. And then the main designer behind the trains was Raymond Loewy of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And this included him designing the sky blue, cream, and gold and silver paint scheme of the train, which did continue inside of the train as well, into the coaches, sleepers, lounges, and dining car service. So we are going to talk a bit about the dining car service, since this is tradition now on these videos that we're talking about the dinner. This is the dinner menu from, I believe, the Texas and Pacific section of the Texas Eagle. So as you can see here, like, pretty standard, like a la carte side, they have your appetizers, which they call relishes, which is, juices, soups, celeries, probably with dip, shrimp cocktail. And then on top of that, you have your dinner entrees, which is, a trout, fried chicken, a young turkey with dressing, which I'm assuming means stuffing and currant jelly, which is actually kind of odd considering currant's not really a big flavor in the U.S. A Spanish omelet with bacon, and with bread and butter and the above entrees. Then there's sandwiches, there's salads, side vegetables, which are seasonal vegetables and potatoes, bread, desserts, which also includes prunes and syrup. To each their own. Ice cream and wafers, again, to each their own. The standard way of beverages of like coffee, tea, water, cocoa, milk, that kind of stuff. And the one thing I will say is those Again, over here on the dinner entrees, more or less the same stuff like the fried chicken, and then they have a T-bone steak, and the same stuff is over here with a few additions. Is that again these railways having like this many dinner options? I believe this is from the '50s, so this is like before the major decline of the railroad. So this was actually a pretty normal thing. Like if you really cared, you'd have 5 or 6 like menu dinner entree options, which is like the meat and the sides and that kind of thing. Up here, it comes with your vegetables and whatnot. And it was just that was part of the whole deal. That was like if you really cared about your training, you had like 5 or 6, and if you were like still cared but like not a lot by this point, you usually had about 4. And if you had less than 4, that was like generally a sign that your dinner service is kind of going by the wayside. So at a comparison, around the same time, I believe the like Empire Builder, which is kind of like more or less going towards that mid tier, which I know for a mid tier this is actually pretty high compared to Amtrak, but yeah, they had about 4 meal options in like the mid-ish 50s on the Empire Builder in Western Star. So them having 6 around the same time, and this is again Texas and Pacific, so smaller railroad. This is their only main passenger train, so they might have cared slightly more. But again, this is like they're like at least at this point trying to maintain the highest level of food service. Anyways, moving on. This is an Eagle at St. Louis Union Station, like later in its existence. Another first that the Missouri Pacific claims to have brought to the Southwest is the concept of a dome car, and they referred to them as planetarium domes. And they were, all the rage at the time. And I'm not sure if they included food service in them, but they did have a lounge space on the lower level. But given that lounge could mean any number of things if this wasn't a Pullman served car, I have no real idea. So back in this days, and due to the lack of consistency, a lounge area could mean only seats, a bar space like alcoholic, a snack bar, or a full dining space like on the Super Chief. It also lists this as acclaimed first, and since I was also doing research for Dallas Union Station at the same time, Texas is considered both the Southwest, West, Southeast, and South all at the same time. So I have no idea what qualifies as Southwest in this claim, which is like why I'm saying it's acclaimed first. And we're also talking about this is a different point in history and different part of the country that I don't live in. And even to this day, Texas seems to have a little bit of an identity crisis. So I'm not really sure, like when they say Southwest and the Missouri Pacific, does like what that means to verify whether or not this is true? Because I know at this point, in the Missouri Pacific and passenger train history, this is about a year or so before the launch of the Southern Santa Fe domes. So I know they didn't have it, and that's generally what I think of as the Southwest. I don't really think of Texas as being the Southwest. I mean, I know like El Paso area does kind of qualify because it's right over the border from New Mexico, but like I don't consider the heart of Texas. Like I don't really consider that southwestern. I kind of consider Texas its own thing and its own identity. But apparently Texas has like all of the identities at once, so I don't really get it. So that's why I'm putting in this like massive caveat and explanation of my thought process. So I don't really know if another railroad that kind of runs in what we think of as the Southwest had dome cars by this point or not, because I don't know what Southwest means in the context of Texas. So again, long ramble to say that I don't know if this claim is true. And this might be true if you talk to a different person. So I don't know, and I'm just saying they claim to be the first. I can't confirm that because Texas is weird, so I'm just leaving it there. So, anyways, let's talk a bit about the equipment on this train. And since this train fanned out at Longview, it did run in multiple sections instead of as one train. And like the Sunshine Special that came before it, it connected all the major cities in Texas and points east through St. Louis. So for the Fort Worth El Paso section of the Texas Eagle, the train had 5 sleepers, which is mostly 14-4 sleepers, which is 14 roomettes, 4 double bedrooms, 3 coach cars, a lounge with 5 bedrooms in it, and a diner. The Houston San Antonio section had 7 sleepers, which was a mix of 14-4s and 10-6s, which were both 14 roomettes, 4 double bedrooms, 10 roomettes, 6 double bedrooms, 7 coaches, 2 diner lounges. And then the final section to Little Rock had 2 coaches, 2 14-4 sleepers, and a food service car. And for whatever reason, the Missouri Pacific's like I think the Northern Pacific and Great Northern were kind of like this too. They liked the 14-4 for whatever reason, which, as I mentioned, is 14 roomettes, which is one person, and 4 double bedrooms, which is 2 people. And it's also kind of a misconception that the 10-6 sleeper was the only type of sleeper before Amtrak. This was just the type that Amtrak liked when it formed in 1971 and tended to keep the most of. And also through history, they did have a bunch of, like, I can't remember what it is, like the 12 or 14 double bedroom sleepers. They had a few of those still floating around in the 90s. But the 10-6 was just one of the more common type, and it was the one Amtrak liked the most. So that's the one people who know anything about this, who didn't live through this era, or at least are like me, who remember Amtrak, not necessarily what came before it, think of as being like the pinnacle or the majority of the sleeper cars. Anyways, time would not be on the side of the Missouri Pacific. And just like other railroads, going into the 60s, they started facing increased competition from trucks and buses, which led to their already reasonably low traffic volumes to decline. Although the Missouri Pacific had connections to industries like, the petrochemical industry in Texas, say on like the Rock Island, it was still not enough to keep them afloat, or at least on steady footing throughout their history. The Missouri Pacific started shedding its passenger fleet in the early to mid 60s, and even though some of these routes had 4 trains per day, as I mentioned at the beginning of the 60s, these days were really short lived. And passenger service declined on the Texas Eagle route fairly quickly. Like the Sunshine Special had limped on as an unnamed secondary train until 1962, and it was finally canceled. And in 1969, the El Paso segment of the Texas Eagle itself was canceled, and the train kept running till San Antonio until 1970. And the Missouri Pacific even argued that the Texas Eagle was an interstate train, but a series of intrastate trains. And at this point, the Texas Railroad Commission allowed them to discontinue the train south of Texarkana because they agreed with them on this asinine argument. And this was also done just a few months before the Amtrak Act was signed in 1970, which would have actually forbidden its termination. And the train I have on here, I believe, is just like a standard mail train on the Missouri Pacific. And other quick note, I don't know if the 50 is the train number or the engine number, because as far as I am aware, and this may not be true, that the SP was the only major railroad that really put train numbers on the trains as well as the engine number. So I don't know if 50 is the train number or the engine number. And since I can't really narrow down when this is, I don't really have a schedule to go dig through on the internet. So, yeah, if any of you know more about the Missouri Pacific, like, did they number their trains or not? So, answer that down below. So I can know for future reference whenever I'm digging through stuff like this, I can maybe make an attempt to figure out what train these are. That would be appreciated because, yeah, again, like, I'm only aware of the SP doing this as a practice. I'm not really aware of like other railroads doing that. And I also will note that at this point, the through sleepers to other parts of the country were gone. I forgot to mention this, but at its height at St. Louis, there were connections like through sleepers to New York on the Pennsylvania Railroad and Washington on the Baltimore and Ohio. And by the mid '60s, these were all gone. And some claim that the Texas Eagle was an all-coach train at this point. Other points sources say that train still ran with a few sleepers, even though they weren't run by Pullman anymore. So again, that was one of those deals that people argue over, but don't necessarily make a clear distinction on. But this wasn't entirely the end of the Texas Eagle, and although Amtrak discontinued what was left of it in 1971, it was revived as the Inter-American in 1974, and this train ran to Laredo, where one of the Missouri Pacific's predecessor trains, the Aztec Eagle, would pick up and connect through to Mexico City on the Nacional de Mexico, which is was their state-run railway. And this train also had a couple other sections, and which was one to Houston and one to LA on the Sunset Limited. And this was an on and off arrangement from 1979 onwards. And currently, Amtrak runs cars through on the Sunset Limited, but the section to Houston is also a distant memory. And the Houston section actually ran it ran from Fort Worth, I believe, to Dallas, and then down to Houston over the SP tracks. And this was a replacement for a discontinued connection that they had via the Lone Star, and was the first passenger train to actually run those SP tracks since 1958 when the Sunbeam was canceled. So, and then also because of the whole way trains are numbered and way things are considered, technically the Texas Eagle is now the longest train in America because it's considered separate from the Sunset Limited that it travels with a couple cars with through to LA, which is still a long-standing tradition, although the connection used to happen at El Paso, not at San Antonio. But because of shenanigans with Amtrak, that's not an option for them anymore. And while we end on the note of an Amtrak train just sitting here, yeah, this is going to be the end of this video, and then there will be more videos to come. I hope you did enjoy. There is a Discord now. The link should be down below. Liking, sharing, subscribing, commenting, answering the question about whether or not the Missouri Pacific numbered its trains, like had like a letterboard number somewhere on the train. Like I would like to know that. And anyways, yeah, just thank you for watching, and I hope you did enjoy and come back for the next one.